There are stories that begin with fire. There are stories that begin with gods descending from mountains or seas parting before armies. This is not one of those stories. This is a story that begins with silence, with fields that no longer grow grain, with cities mentioned once in ancient records and never again, with lands that are not cursed, not forbidden by divine decree but simply avoided. The oldest texts we possess, written in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay more than 4,000 years ago, rarely describe catastrophe directly. They do not give us the moment of destruction. They give us something else. They give us the world that remained afterward. A world still inhabited, still chronicled, still mapped, but marked by absences that were never explained, by voids in the landscape that were treated as fact. This is not a story about what happened. This is a story about what was left behind. And tonight, as the light dims and the world outside grows quiet, we return to those oldest voices, not to hear them proclaim disaster, but to listen carefully to what they chose not to say. If this story resonates with you, feel free to like or subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of the catastrophe, because that moment is never given to us, but the beginning of the record, the beginning of what the scribes chose to preserve, Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. For thousands of years, this region was the cradle of written history. It was here that human beings first pressed symbols into clay and created something that could outlast memory, something that could speak across centuries. The earliest texts are practical. They record grain, livestock, transactions, the mundane architecture of survival. But woven into these records, appearing again and again in different forms, are references to places that exist only as warnings, to lands that are named but never visited, to cities that appear in one text and vanish from all others. The scribes do not explain why. They simply note the absence. They record the gap. Consider the city of Izin, a major urban center in southern Mesopotamia during the early 2nd millennium BCE. It appears frequently in royal inscriptions and administrative documents. Then consider the city of Larsa, its rival. Both cities thrived. Both competed for dominance. Both left extensive records. But scattered among these texts are references to other places with names that appear once or twice and then disappear entirely from the historical record. No destruction is described, no conquest is mentioned, the names simply stop appearing. Trade routes that once passed through these locations are rerouted, new paths are established, and in the silence where an explanation should be, there is only the fact of avoidance. The text suggests that something about these places changed, not in a way that required explanation, but in a way that everyone understood. The land itself had become unusable. What does it mean for land to become unusable? In our modern context, we think of contamination, of industrial accidents or nuclear disasters, of places rendered uninhabitable by human activity. But the ancient world had no such framework. They had no concept of radiation or chemical pollution. What they had was observation. They could see when fields no longer produced crops. They could taste when water became bitter. They could watch as soil turned grey and lifeless, and they could make the practical decision to leave. The Sumerian texts, among the oldest coherent written records we possess, contain numerous references to agricultural collapse, not as catastrophe, but as condition. The land is described as tired, as salted, as refusing to yield. Modern scholars have identified genuine environmental crises in ancient Mesopotamia. Irrigation without proper drainage led to salinization. Salt accumulated in the soil, making it inhospitable to barley and wheat. This was a real, documented process. But the pattern in the text suggests something beyond gradual agricultural decline. It suggests regions that became suddenly, inexplicably barren. In the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, a text composed around 2000 BCE, the city is described in ruins. But the description focuses not on the act of destruction, but on the state of abandonment. The fields are empty, the livestock are gone, the waterways are clogged with sediment. The text does not say that an army burned the fields or that a flood destroyed the crops. It says only that the land no longer sustains life, that the goddess Nungal has turned her face away, that the place has been handed over to the wind. This is the language of aftermath, of a world that has moved past some unspoken threshold into a new, diminished state. The catastrophe, if there was one, happened offstage. What we inherit is the consequence, the record of a city that ceased to function, not because it was destroyed in a single dramatic event, but because the conditions necessary for urban life had quietly, irreversibly collapsed. There is a region in southern Iraq, near the ancient city of Nippur, where the soil still bears the marks of extreme heat. Not recent heat, not modern warfare, but heat so intense it fused sand into glass. Archaeologists have found these glassy deposits in layers that correspond roughly to the early Bronze Age. No natural explanation has been universally accepted. Lightning strikes can create fulgurites, tubes of fused sand, but not the widespread vitrification found at some Mesopotamian sites. Volcanic activity is absent from the region's geology. Meteorite impacts leave distinct craters and debris fields. None of these signatures match the pattern. What remains is the fact of the heat itself. Temperatures sufficient to melt silica, temperatures that would have rendered the immediate area uninhabitable for generations. And in the text from this period there are references to winds that burn, to skies that glow at night, to stones that have been changed by fire, but never to the source of that fire. The texts do not say, a great fire fell from the sky. They do not say, the gods threw down flames. They say, the steppe burned. They say, the heat was remembered. They describe the effect without the cause. This is a pattern that repeats across multiple texts from multiple periods. The Era epic, composed sometime in the late 2nd or early 1st millennium BCE, describes the god era unleashing destruction across the land. But even in this mythological framework, the destruction is described in terms of its lingering effects. Cities are left empty, fields are abandoned, the people scatter, the god's anger is satisfied, but the world does not return to its previous state. It continues in a new configuration, one shaped by absence, by the places that are no longer viable, by the recognition that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. Consider how we remember disaster. In our own time, we have photographs, video footage, survivor testimonies. We document the moment of impact, the explosion, the collapse, the flood. We build memorials, we create museums, we ensure that the event itself is never forgotten. But in the ancient world, memory worked differently. Without photography, without mass media, without standardized historical record-keeping, the event could fade within a generation. What persisted was not the story of what happened, but the knowledge of what to avoid. The parents would tell the children, do not go there. The children would tell their children the same, and eventually the reason would be lost. All that remained was the prohibition, the understanding that certain lands were not for habitation, that certain paths were not to be taken, that some silences were not meant to be questioned. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important chronological documents from ancient Mesopotamia, records the reigns of kings stretching back into mythological time. Before the flood, it claims, kings ruled for thousands of years. After the flood, their reigns become more human in scale, dozens of years instead of millennia. The flood itself is presented as a dividing line, a moment when the world changed fundamentally. But what was the flood? The text does not describe it in detail. It simply notes that kingship was swept away and then descended from heaven again in a new location. The catastrophe exists as a marker, as a way of organizing time, before and after. But the nature of the catastrophe is assumed to be understood. It requires no elaboration. Everyone knows what the flood means. Or perhaps no one remembers, but everyone agrees to treat it as if they do. This is the paradox at the heart of these texts. They reference an event that changed everything, but they never explain what the event was. They describe its consequences in precise practical detail. The cities that were abandoned, the trade routes that shifted, the lands that became barren, but the cause remains implicit, hidden behind phrases like when the storm had swept over, or after the great destruction. Modern readers want the story. We want to know what happened. We want the explosion, the fire, the descending flames. But the ancient scribes give us only the world that came after. And perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps the aftermath was the only part that mattered, because understanding how the catastrophe occurred would not help anyone survive it. But understanding which lands to avoid, which waters to not drink, which ruins to leave untouched, that knowledge was practical. That knowledge kept people alive. There is a tablet housed in the British Museum, designated as K3657, that contains a fragment of the Era epic. The text is damaged, with significant portions missing, but what remains is telling. Era, the god of plague and violence, speaks of destroying cities and scattering populations, but he does not describe the method. He does not explain how the destruction will occur. Instead, he focuses on the result. "I shall turn inhabited cities into wilderness," he declares. "I shall flatten mountains and fell their wildlife. I shall devastate seas and destroy their yield. I shall wreck dwellings and make the shepherd's lean-to into waste." The language is agricultural, economic. The catastrophe is measured not in death tolls but in lost productivity, in ecosystems that cease to function, in land that no longer supports human life. This is not the poetry of explosion. It is the poetry of collapse, of systems breaking down, of the slow recognition that return is impossible, and so the cities fall silent. Not all at once, not in a single moment of fire and chaos, but gradually, incrementally. The texts from the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, show us this process in administrative detail. A city that once exported grain stops appearing in trade records. A temple that received regular offerings is no longer mentioned in accounting tablets. A governor who once sent monthly reports to the capital simply ceases correspondence. The bureaucratic record does not explain these absences, it simply incorporates them. The administrative network adjusts, resources are redirected, new centres of power emerge in different locations, and the cities that have gone quiet remain quiet. No expeditions are sent to investigate, no attempts at reconquest or rebuilding are described. The silence is accepted as final. Consider the city of Sippar, a major religious and economic centre in northern Babylonia. It thrived for centuries, housing a famous temple to the sun god Shamash. The city appears continuously in texts throughout the early second millennium. Then, during a period that scholars associate with increased instability and environmental stress, references to Sippar become sporadic. Some texts mention it, others do not. There is no record of siege, no description of conquest, no lamentation over its destruction. Instead, there is simply a thinning of the documentary record, as if the city were fading from relevance rather than being actively destroyed. Later texts, centuries afterward, sometimes reference Sippar as if it still exists, as if it occupies a kind of liminal space between presence and absence, a place that was once vital, that still has a name, but that no longer functions as cities are meant to function. This pattern repeats across southern Mesopotamia. Cities that existed for generations suddenly become peripheral. Their names persist in historical memory, but their function ceases. And alongside these vanishing cities, the texts describe environmental conditions that suggest why abandonment might have been the only rational choice. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its standard Babylonian version, includes a description of the cedar forest, a place of great fertility and divine presence. But other texts from the same period describe regions where vegetation has died, where the ground is described as white, suggesting salt accumulation or ash, where water sources have become bitter or have dried up entirely, where the air itself is described as wrong, as carrying heat where there should be coolness, as smelling of something that has no name. The ancient scribes had limited vocabulary for environmental disaster. They had words for flood and drought, for wind and fire, but they had no terms for the kinds of prolonged ecological collapse that make land permanently uninhabitable. So they reached for approximation. They described the land as angry, as wounded, as having turned its face away. These are not scientific descriptions, but they are not purely poetic either. They are the language of people who understood that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between human beings and the earth they depended on, that certain lands had become hostile, not through divine curse, but through some alteration in the physical world itself, an alteration that the texts acknowledge but never fully explain. Now we must turn to the fire, because the fire is everywhere in these records, even when it is not described. The Sumerian texts speak of burning winds. The Akkadian epics reference skies that glow at night without stars. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tall el-Hamidiyya in Syria have revealed layers of ash and vitrified material dating to the Bronze Age. These are not cooking fires, not the controlled burns of agricultural clearing. The temperatures required to create vitrified brick exceed anything that normal human activity could produce. They suggest exposure to heat so intense that it fundamentally altered the molecular structure of clay and stone. Modern analysts have compared these findings to the effects of aerial bombardment in World War II, to the aftermath of firestorms that consumed entire cities. But there were no bombers in 2500 BCE, there were no incendiary weapons, there was only heat. Heat that the texts remember without explaining, heat that becomes part of the landscape, part of the permanent record of what that place now is. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest versions of the Mesopotamian flood narrative, the god Enlil becomes disturbed by human noise and decides to destroy humanity. But before the flood, he sends other disasters: drought, plague, famine. The text describes these methodically, almost clinically. The fields crack open, the rivers run dry, the people begin to die. But even in this mythological context, the text focuses on environmental collapse, on the breaking of the systems that sustain life. The flood, when it finally comes, is almost anticlimactic. It is simply the final stage of a process that has been unfolding for years, and when the waters recede, the world that emerges is not the world that existed before. It is diminished, fragile. The survivors understand that they exist on sufferance, that the conditions for their existence are not guaranteed, that catastrophe is not an exception, but a possibility that the world contains within itself at all times. This understanding permeates the later texts. By the time we reach the Neo-Assyrian period, roughly 900 to 600 BCE, the scribes have inherited centuries of records describing lands that failed, cities that were abandoned, regions that became taboo, and they incorporate this knowledge into their own worldview. When Assyrian kings describe their conquests, they sometimes mention destroying cities so thoroughly that they become uninhabitable. They sow the fields with salt, they reroute water sources, they ensure that the defeated population cannot return and rebuild. This is not random cruelty. It is a calculated strategy based on an understanding that land can be made to refuse life, that certain actions create consequences that outlast any individual human lifespan. The Assyrians learned from the texts they inherited. They learned that destruction need not be immediate to be total, that rendering a place uninhabitable achieves the same result as burning it to the ground, but with a permanence that fire alone cannot guarantee. But there are places that were not destroyed by human hands, places that the texts describe as having been struck down or laid waste, without attributing the cause to any army or king. The city of Ur, one of the great urban centres of ancient Sumer, was abandoned around 2000 BCE. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur describes the city in vivid detail. The walls are intact, the buildings still stand, but there is no one there. The text says that Nanna, the moon god who was the patron deity of Ur, has departed, that the divine presence has withdrawn, and in the absence of that presence the city cannot function. This is not architecture failing, this is meaning failing. The city is a shell. Everything necessary for urban life is present except the animating force that makes those buildings into a home. The text never explains why Nanna left, it simply records that he did, and that his departure made Ur into a place of echoes. Modern archaeology has confirmed that Ur was indeed abandoned during this period, though the city was later reoccupied. Excavations show no signs of violent destruction, no burned layers, no evidence of siege warfare. Instead, there is simply a gap in the archaeological record, a period when the city appears to have been largely empty. Some scholars attribute this to changing river patterns. The Euphrates shifted its course, they argue, making Ur less viable as a port city. Others point to political instability, to the collapse of the Ur III dynasty and the fragmentation of centralized power. These are reasonable explanations, they fit the evidence, but they do not fully account for the language of the lamentation, for the sense of fundamental wrongness that permeates the text, for the description of a city that has not been destroyed but has been abandoned by something essential, something that the scribes could only describe as divine presence, because they had no other vocabulary for it. What we are witnessing in these texts is the transformation of catastrophe into geography. The event, whatever it was, becomes a place. The memory becomes a location, and that location is marked not by monuments or memorials but by absence, by the understanding that these lands are not for use. The The texts do not say, "Here is where the catastrophe occurred." They say, "Here is where nothing grows." They say, "Here is where the water cannot be drunk." They say, "Here is where travellers do not stop." The catastrophe has been absorbed into the landscape itself. It is no longer history, it is terrain. And the people who live in the region understand this instinctively. They route their trade caravans around certain areas. They choose to build new cities at a distance from old ruins. They pass down the knowledge that some places are to be avoided, even if the original reason has been forgotten. There is a cuneiform text from the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, that lists abandoned cities. It is a geographical reference document meant to help scribes and administrators understand the landscape they governed. And alongside cities that are described as currently inhabited, there are cities marked as ruined or empty. No explanation is given for why these cities are ruined. No historical context is provided. They are simply noted as facts of geography, as permanent features of the land. This suggests that by the 7th century BCE, more than 1,000 years after some of these cities were abandoned, they were still understood as uninhabitable, still marked as places to be avoided. The catastrophe, whatever it was, had achieved a kind of immortality, not through story, not through memory, but through the continued avoidance of the spaces it had touched. Consider the weight of that inheritance. Imagine being a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, choosing where to plant your fields. You have access to land, you have seed, you have the tools necessary for cultivation. But there is a region, not far from where you live, where no one plants, where the soil looks wrong, where the elders tell you simply, "not there." They do not explain why. Perhaps they themselves do not know. Perhaps the knowledge was lost 2 generations ago, or 5 or 10, but the prohibition remains, and you honour it. Not because you believe in curses, not because you fear divine punishment, but because the collective wisdom of your community, accumulated over centuries, has marked that land as unreliable, as other, as outside the boundaries of the safe and knowable world. This is how trauma becomes geography, how history becomes instinct. The texts show us this transformation again and again. A catastrophe occurs, or is believed to have occurred, and the immediate response is documentation. The scribes record what they can observe, the damaged fields, the abandoned settlements, the altered landscape. But as time passes, the documentation becomes less detailed. The focus shifts from what happened to what exists now, from cause to consequence, and eventually the consequence is all that remains. The texts stop trying to explain. They simply map. They create inventories of the world as it is. And in those inventories, certain places are marked with silence, with absence, with the understanding that some questions do not have answers, or that the answers have been deliberately withheld. Why would a culture choose not to record a catastrophe? We must consider this carefully, because it contradicts our modern instinct to document everything, to preserve every detail, to ensure that future generations understand exactly what occurred. But the ancient world operated under different assumptions. Knowledge was not always beneficial. Some information was considered dangerous. Some stories were thought to have the power to bring about the very disasters they described. If a catastrophe had occurred through human action, through some terrible mistake or forbidden practice, recording the details might enable repetition, might teach future generations how to unlock forces that should remain locked. Better perhaps to record only the result, to show what happens when certain boundaries are crossed, without explaining where those boundaries are or how the crossing occurred. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, contains a telling detail. When Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the world from her corpse, he establishes order. He assigns the gods their roles. He creates humanity to serve the gods. And then he establishes tablets of destiny, records of what has been and what will be. But these tablets are not public documents. They are kept in the highest heaven. They are the possession of Marduk alone. The implication is clear. Complete knowledge is the privilege of the divine. Human beings receive only the information necessary for survival. And if a catastrophe occurred that challenged divine order, that suggested the gods themselves were capable of losing control, perhaps that information would be restricted. Perhaps the scribes who served the temples would be instructed to record the aftermath without recording the event, to preserve the consequences as warning without preserving the method as instruction. This brings us to the concept of forbidden knowledge. Every ancient culture had information that was restricted, religious mysteries that could only be revealed to initiates, technical knowledge that was guarded by professional guilds, political secrets that were kept by the ruling class. The catastrophe, if there was one, may have fallen into this category. The priests who understood what had occurred may have decided that general knowledge would cause more harm than ignorance, that the population needed to know which lands to avoid, which practices to abstain from, but did not need to know why. And so the event was encoded, hidden in plain sight, described through its effects rather than its causes, made into myth rather than history, transformed from a specific occurrence into a general principle about the relationship between human beings and the forces that govern their world. The boundary between myth and history was never clear in the ancient world. The same texts that record grain distributions and tax receipts also describe gods walking among mortals. The same kings who built irrigation systems claim to have defeated chaos monsters. This was not naivety. It was a different epistemology, a different way of organizing knowledge. Myth was not false history. It was deep history. It was the layer beneath the surface events, the pattern that repeated across time. And if a catastrophe had occurred, that was so profound, so world-altering, that it seemed to reveal something fundamental about the nature of existence itself, it would be recorded as myth. Not because the scribes did not believe it had happened, but because myth was the appropriate container for that level of significance. We see this in the flood narratives. Every culture in ancient Mesopotamia had a flood story. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. The details varied, but the structure remained consistent. Humanity grows numerous or loud or sinful. The gods decide to destroy them. One man is warned. He builds a vessel. He survives. The world begins again. This is clearly a mythic pattern. It bears the hallmarks of religious literature. But it is also tied to specific geography. The flood survivors land on specific mountains. They establish specific cities. The narrative contains genealogies that connect mythic time to historical time. It is as if the texts are saying, this is both myth and memory. This is both a story about the gods and a story about something that actually occurred. And the two meanings are not in conflict. They are complementary. What if the catastrophe we are seeking was recorded the same way? What if it exists in the texts not as a historical event with dates and locations, but as a mythic pattern that keeps repeating? The land that fails, the city that falls silent, the region that is marked for avoidance. These appear again and again in Mesopotamian literature, each time with slightly different details, each time attributed to different causes, but always following the same trajectory: habitability to collapse, presence to absence, use to avoidance. The specifics change, but the pattern remains. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the scribes were not trying to record a single event. Perhaps they were trying to record a category of event, a type of catastrophe that could occur in multiple times and places. That had occurred. That might occur again. This interpretation gains support when we examine the prophetic literature. The later Mesopotamian texts, particularly those from the first millennium BCE, contain numerous prophecies of destruction. Cities will fall, lands will become barren, the social order will collapse. These prophecies are usually framed as warnings, as conditional statements. If the king does not perform the proper rituals, if the people do not honor the gods, if certain boundaries are violated, then catastrophe will follow. But the descriptions of the threatened catastrophe are remarkably specific. They describe environmental collapse in detail, the failure of water sources, the death of vegetation, the transformation of fertile land into waste. These descriptions are too precise to be purely imaginative. They read like memory. Like the prophets are describing not what might happen in the future, but what they know has happened in the past. The prophecy is not prediction. It is warning based on precedent. And the warning is always the same at its core. Do not cross certain boundaries. Do not pursue certain kinds of knowledge. Do not anger the forces that maintain order. The specific boundaries vary. The specific knowledge is never detailed. The specific forces remain unnamed. But the consequence is always environmental collapse, always the transformation of inhabited land into wasteland, always the creation of regions that must be avoided. The texts are teaching their readers how to recognize the approach of catastrophe, not by looking for explosions or invasions, but by watching the land itself, by noticing when fields fail, when water changes, when the environment begins to refuse human presence. These are the signs, these are the warnings, and the fact that such warnings needed to be written suggests that the catastrophe had occurred before, that people had failed to recognize the signs, that by the time the disaster was obvious, it was too late to prevent. Now we must address what modern audiences want from these texts. We want answers. We want to know what happened. Was it a meteor impact? A volcanic eruption? A nuclear war between ancient civilizations? The internet is full of theories. Ancient astronauts, advanced technology, lost superweapons. These theories are appealing because they provide clear explanations. They give us something concrete to visualize, a specific event with a specific cause that we can point to and say, that was it. But the texts do not support these interpretations. They do not describe flying machines or atomic weapons. They do not speak of civilizations more advanced than the one leaving the records. What they describe is much simpler and much stranger. They describe a world where catastrophe is ambient, where the possibility of total environmental collapse is simply part of the fabric of existence, where the land itself can turn against human habitation without any exotic cause required. This is harder for us to accept than stories of ancient technology or divine intervention, because it suggests that catastrophe does not require a dramatic cause, that the systems we depend on for survival are fragile in ways we cannot always perceive, that the boundary between habitable and uninhabitable can shift gradually, almost invisibly, until one day a community realizes that the land they have worked for generations will no longer sustain them. And that realization does not come with thunder or fire, it comes with a failed harvest, with water that tastes wrong, with children who sicken for no apparent reason, with the slow, terrible understanding that this place is no longer viable, that departure is the only option, that the home you built will be left to silence. The texts preserve this reality without drama, without the comfort of a clear villain or a heroic resolution. They simply note that certain cities were abandoned, that certain lands became empty, that trade routes changed course, that people moved elsewhere and began again. The emotional weight of this displacement is sometimes acknowledged. The lamentations mourn the loss of beloved cities. They describe the pain of leaving temples and homes. But even in mourning, they do not explain why the loss was necessary. They describe the grief of aftermath without providing the clarity of cause. And perhaps this reflects the actual experience of the people who lived through these events. Perhaps they themselves did not know why their world was failing. They could observe the symptoms but not diagnose the disease. They could document the progression but not identify the origin. Archaeological evidence supports this reading. Excavations across Mesopotamia have revealed numerous sites that were abandoned during the Bronze Age, not all at once, not in a single catastrophic event, but gradually over decades and centuries. Some of these abandonments coincide with documented political upheavals, the fall of dynasties, the invasion of new peoples. But others occur during periods of apparent stability. The political structure remains intact. The neighbouring cities continue to function. But one settlement after another simply empties. The population disperses. And when archaeologists examine the material remains, they find patterns that suggest environmental stress, evidence of flooding or drought, signs of agricultural decline, indications that the carrying capacity of the land had been exceeded and the ecosystem was breaking down under the pressure of sustained human occupation. This is not the catastrophe of myth. It is the catastrophe of systems failure, of irrigation channels that silt up faster than they can be cleared, of soil that becomes too saline to support crops, of water tables that drop below the reach of existing wells, of forests cut down for fuel and building material that never regrow, of fisheries depleted beyond recovery. These are quiet disasters. They do not announce themselves with explosions or divine pronouncements. They emerge from the accumulated effects of thousands of individual decisions, from the normal operation of agriculture and urbanism pushed just slightly beyond sustainable limits. And the tragedy is that by the time the problem is obvious, the damage is already done. The land has crossed a threshold. It cannot be easily restored. Abandonment becomes inevitable. But the text also describes something else. something that does not fit neatly into the model of gradual environmental decline. They describe events that were sudden, unexpected, that changed the landscape in ways that cannot be explained by salinization or deforestation. The burning winds, the glowing skies, the vitrified soil. These descriptions appear alongside the accounts of slow collapse, suggesting that the ancient world experienced both types of disaster, the gradual and the acute, the predictable and the inexplicable. And perhaps the scribes did not always distinguish clearly between them. Perhaps a region that had been slowly declining for decades was finally abandoned after some acute shock, a drought that lasted one season too long, a flood that damaged irrigation infrastructure beyond repair, an outbreak of disease that killed too many workers to maintain the agricultural system. The final trigger might have been dramatic, but it was simply the last weight added to a structure that was already failing. This layering of causes makes it impossible to identify a single catastrophe. Instead, we see a landscape of catastrophes, multiple events, multiple processes, unfolding across centuries, creating a cumulative effect that transformed the geography of Mesopotamia. Some regions recovered, some never did, and the texts do not always distinguish between temporary and permanent abandonment. A city might be described as empty in one text and reoccupied in another, written a century later. The catastrophe was not always final, but the memory of it persisted. The knowledge that this place had failed once, could fail again, remained part of the cultural understanding of that location. It became part of the identity of the place itself. There is a term that appears in multiple Sumerian texts, Kurnugiah, the land of no return. It is usually understood as a reference to the underworld, the realm of the dead. But some scholars have noted that the term is also used to describe actual geographical locations, regions that are referenced in administrative documents as existing but uninhabitable, places where people do not go, or if they go, they do not come back. This linguistic overlap between the mythological underworld and actual wastelands is revealing. It suggests that for the ancient Mesopotamians there was not a sharp distinction between the realm of death and the dead lands of the living world. Both were places of absence, of silence, of endings without return. The catastrophe, whatever its nature, created earthly underworlds, places that belong to death while still existing on the surface of the world. Imagine travelling through such a landscape. You're a merchant, perhaps, or a messenger carrying tablets between cities. Your route takes you near one of these regions. You can see it in the distance, ruins maybe, or empty plains where cities once stood. The road curves away from it. Deliberately, clearly, this is not accident. This is design. The road was built to avoid that place, and as you pass by, you notice things. The vegetation changes, becomes sparse, takes on a grey cast. The birds avoid flying over it. There is a smell in the air. Faint but wrong, not decay exactly. Something else, something mineral. And you remember what your father told you, what his father told him. Do not stop there, do not investigate, do not wonder, keep moving. Some silences are meant to be respected. This is how the catastrophe perpetuates itself, not through active danger necessarily, but through inherited caution, through the accumulated wisdom of avoidance. And the texts preserve this wisdom without explaining its origin. They map the safe routes, they identify the viable lands, and by implication, they mark everything else as other. As outside the realm of normal human activity, the catastrophe has become infrastructure. It shapes trade, it determines settlement patterns, it influences decisions made by people who have no direct memory of what occurred, who know only that their grandparents avoided those places and their grandparents before them, and that this pattern of avoidance has become indistinguishable from common sense. But there are always those who forget, or who never learned, or who decided that the old warnings no longer apply. The texts occasionally reference attempts to resettle abandoned cities, to reclaim lands that had been left fallow for generations. These attempts are described with a curious ambivalence. Sometimes they succeed. The new settlers establish themselves, the city lives. Again, the land yields crops, and the catastrophe is revealed to have been temporary, a wound that healed once pressure was removed. But other times, the attempts fail. The settlers sicken, the crops wither, and the land reasserts its refusal to support human life. These failures are rarely explained in detail. The texts simply note that the settlement was abandoned again, that the attempt to return was unsuccessful, and the prohibition is reinforced. The knowledge is renewed. This place is not for us. This silence is not to be broken. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a civilization existing in intimate relationship with catastrophe, not as something that happened once, long ago, and was overcome, but as something that was always potentially present, always threatening at the margins. The Mesopotamians built their cities in a difficult environment, between two rivers that flooded unpredictably, on soil that required constant management to remain productive, under skies that could withhold rain for years and then deliver it in destructive torrents. They knew that their existence was conditional, that the balance between flourishing and collapse was delicate, and they encoded this knowledge into their literature, their religion, their administrative practices. The catastrophe, whether it was one event or many, became a lens through which they understood their own fragility, their own dependence on systems they could not fully control. This is why the texts do not provide clear explanations, because the catastrophe was not an aberration. It was a revelation. It revealed what had always been true, that human civilization exists on sufferance, that the land can refuse us, that order is temporary and collapse is always waiting. To explain the catastrophe in detail would be to suggest that it was unique, that if they could only avoid repeating that one mistake, they would be safe. But safety was never available. The world they inhabited was fundamentally unstable, and the appropriate response was not confidence but caution, not mastery but humility, not explanation but acknowledgement. The gods in these texts are not distant observers, they are participants in the catastrophe, but their role is complex, ambiguous. In some versions they cause the disaster, in others they are powerless to prevent it. In still others, they seem as confused as the human victims, scrambling to understand what has gone wrong. The Epic of Atrahasis presents the gods as initially unified in their decision to destroy humanity through flood, but as the waters rise, some of them begin to regret. The mother goddess Nintu weeps. She mourns the loss of her creations. She compares herself to a woman in labour whose children are still born. The other gods huddle together like frightened animals. They realise too late that they have unleashed something they cannot control, that the flood, once begun, follows its own logic, its own momentum, and even divine power struggles to contain it. This portrayal is striking because it undermines the usual narrative of divine omnipotence. The gods in Mesopotamian literature are powerful, yes, but they are not all-powerful. They make mistakes. They act out of emotion rather than wisdom. They create problems they cannot solve, and when catastrophe occurs, they are implicated in it. They bear responsibility, but they also suffer from it. Their temples are destroyed along with human cities. Their worship ceases when their worshippers die. The gods need humanity as much as humanity needs the gods. This interdependence means that catastrophe is never simply a divine punishment. It is a rupture in the entire cosmic order, a breakdown of the relationship that sustains both heaven and earth. Consider what this means for memory. If the catastrophe involved divine action, recording it in detail would mean recording divine failure. It would mean preserving evidence that the gods made errors, that they lost control, that they caused suffering they later regretted. This is dangerous knowledge in a theocratic society. It undermines the authority of the priesthood. It challenges the legitimacy of the king, who rules by divine mandate. It suggests that the cosmic order is more fragile than the official theology claims. Better, perhaps, to leave the details vague, to describe the catastrophe in ways that allow for multiple interpretations, to create texts that acknowledge something terrible occurred without specifying exactly what or why. This ambiguity protects the divine reputation, while still preserving the memory that catastrophe is possible, that it has happened before, that it could happen again. But there is another possibility, one that is even more unsettling. What if the catastrophe was not caused by the gods at all? What if it was something that happened to them as well as to humanity? The texts occasionally hint at this. They reference forces that exist beyond divine control. Tiamat, the primordial chaos, must be defeated to create the ordered world. But she is never fully destroyed. She is only contained, transformed. Her body becomes the earth and sky. But the implication is that chaos remains, embedded in the structure of reality itself, always threatening to reassert itself, always waiting for order to weaken. If the catastrophe was a resurgence of this primordial chaos, an eruption of forces that predate the gods themselves, then no divine explanation would be possible. The gods would be as helpless before it as mortals, and recording this helplessness would serve no purpose. It would only spread despair, so instead the texts focus on what can be controlled, on human behavior, on ritual observance, on maintaining the proper relationships between mortals and gods. The catastrophe becomes a moral lesson, a warning about what happens when these relationships break down, when humans become too numerous, too loud, too independent, when they forget their place in the cosmic hierarchy, when they pursue knowledge or power beyond what they were meant to possess. The actual mechanism of the catastrophe fades into the background. What matters is the takeaway, the instruction. Do not anger the gods. Do not disrupt the order. Do not cross the boundaries that have been established. Follow these rules, and catastrophe can be avoided, or at least postponed, or at least, if it cannot be avoided, you will not be blamed for it. This transformation of catastrophe into moral instruction is visible across multiple texts. The flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh serves as a meditation on mortality. Gilgamesh seeks Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, hoping to learn the secret of eternal life, and Utnapishtim tells him the story. How the gods decided to destroy humanity, how he was warned by the god Ea, how he built the boat and survived. But the secret Gilgamesh seeks is not revealed. Utnapishtim tells him that immortality was granted only once, under unique circumstances that will never be repeated. The catastrophe cannot be used as a blueprint for transcendence. It is simply a fact of the past, a marker of divine caprice. And the lesson is not about how to survive catastrophe. It is about accepting mortality, about understanding that human life is temporary, and that this temporariness is not a flaw, but a fundamental condition of existence. The text is teaching Gilgamesh, and through him the audience, that some things cannot be overcome through strength or cleverness or determination, that the world contains forces beyond human influence, that catastrophe is one of these forces. You cannot prepare for it in any meaningful sense. You cannot prevent it through right action. You can only accept that it is possible, that it has happened, that your own existence, your city, your civilization, all exist within the shadow of potential annihilation. And the proper response is not panic or despair. It is a kind of profound realism, a clear-eyed acknowledgement of limitation. Gilgamesh returns from his quest without the immortality he sought, but he returns with something else, an acceptance of his own nature, an understanding that meaning must be found within the boundaries of mortal life rather than in their transcendence. This philosophical stance permeates the later Mesopotamian literature, the wisdom texts, the prayers, the royal inscriptions. There is a recurring theme of human beings as small, vulnerable, temporary. The gods are great and enduring, but even they are subject to forces beyond their control, and mortals must navigate this uncertain reality with humility and care. The catastrophe, whatever it was, serves as the ultimate proof of this uncertainty. It demonstrates that security is an illusion, that stability is temporary, that the world we build can be unmade, not necessarily through our own fault, not always as punishment for specific transgressions, sometimes simply because the world is capable of producing catastrophe, because destruction is woven into the fabric of existence as deeply as creation. Now consider the practical response to this understanding. If catastrophe is always possible, if it cannot be reliably prevented, then the focus shifts to resilience, to building systems that can absorb shock, to maintaining flexibility rather than rigidity, to distributing resources rather than concentrating them. The Mesopotamian city-state system, with its multiple centers of power, its competing cities, its constant rivalry and alliance, can be understood as a response to catastrophic risk. No single city held all the knowledge, all the resources, all the population. If one city failed, others continued. If one region became uninhabitable, people could relocate. The political fragmentation that characterizes Mesopotamian history was not simply the result of geography or ethnic division. It was also a survival strategy, a hedge against total collapse. The texts reflect this strategy in how they record information, Knowledge is distributed across multiple archives. Multiple copies of important texts are created and stored in different locations. When archaeologists excavate Mesopotamian sites, they find duplicate tablets. The same hymns, the same king lists, the same legal codes, preserved in multiple cities. This redundancy ensures that if one archive is destroyed, the knowledge survives elsewhere. It is a form of cultural insurance, and it suggests that the scribes who created these texts understood that catastrophe was not hypothetical. That destruction was real and recurring. That memory itself needed to be protected through distribution and repetition. But this raises a question. If the catastrophe was so significant that it required such elaborate measures to preserve memory around it, why not record the event itself with equal care? Why preserve the consequences in such detail while leaving the cause vague? One answer is that the consequences were what mattered, practically. Knowing which lands were viable and which were not meant the difference between survival and starvation. Knowing which cities had been abandoned helped merchants plan routes and administrators allocate resources. This information had immediate utility. The cause of the abandonment, by contrast, was academic. Interesting perhaps, but not essential. Whether a city was destroyed by flood, fire, conquest, or gradual decline, the result was the same. It was no longer inhabited. It should be avoided. That was the knowledge that needed to be preserved. Another answer is more speculative but worth considering. What if multiple catastrophes occurred over the centuries, each with different causes? A major flood in one region, environmental collapse in another, perhaps a meteor impact or volcanic eruption in a third. The texts that survived, that were copied and recopied and transmitted across generations, were the ones that could accommodate multiple causes. That described catastrophe in general terms rather than specific mechanisms. These texts remained relevant across different disasters because they captured a pattern rather than an event. They taught their readers how to recognize the signs of impending collapse, regardless of what was causing it. How to interpret environmental stress. When to abandon a settlement. How to carry knowledge forward into uncertain futures. This meta-knowledge, this understanding of catastrophe as a category, was more valuable than any specific historical account. And so the catastrophe becomes archetypal. It exists in the text not as a single occurrence, but as a recurring possibility. Every generation faces the potential for environmental collapse. Every city exists under the threat of abandonment. Every stable period contains the seeds of instability. The texts do not need to specify which catastrophe they are describing, because they are describing all catastrophes, the pattern that underlies them, the trajectory from flourishing to collapse that can manifest in countless different ways but always follows similar stages. Recognition, denial, adaptation, failure, flight, silence, and then, perhaps after enough time has passed, a cautious return, an attempt to rebuild, sometimes successful, sometimes revealing that the land still refuses, that the wound has not healed, that the silence should have been respected. There are tablets that record dream omens, lists of dreams and their interpretations used by ancient priests to predict the future. Among these omens are dreams of abandoned cities, of walking through empty streets, of finding temples without worshippers. These dreams are interpreted as warnings, as signs that catastrophe approaches, but they are also records of anxiety, of the persistent fear that underlies urban life in Mesopotamia. The fear that one day your own city might become like those other cities, might fall silent, might be abandoned to the wind and sand, might become a place that future generations avoid without knowing why. This fear was not irrational. It was based on observation, on the evidence visible in the landscape, on the ruins that dotted the region, on the stories passed down through generations, on the knowledge that many cities had risen and fallen before, that the current moment of stability was temporary, that catastrophe was always waiting. The scribes who recorded these dreams were not inventing fears from nothing. They were documenting a collective anxiety rooted in experience, in archaeological memory. Every scribe would have been trained in older archives, would have read tablets from cities that no longer existed, would have copied texts that reference places now empty. This was not abstract history. It was tangible proof that urban civilization was fragile, that the institutions they served, the temples and palaces that employed them, could cease to exist, that their own profession, their own identity as keepers of written knowledge, depended on the continuation of complex social structures that had repeatedly failed in the past, and so they preserved warnings. They maintained records of abandoned places. They ensured that future generations would know that catastrophe was not unprecedented, that it had happened before and could happen again. This awareness shaped religious practice. The Mesopotamian ritual calendar was dense with ceremonies designed to maintain cosmic order, to renew divine favor, to prevent the return of chaos. These were not mere formalities. They were understood as essential work, as the labor that kept the world functioning. The priests who performed these rituals were, in their understanding, holding back catastrophe through correct action, through precise repetition of sacred formulas, through offerings made at specified times in specified ways. Any deviation was dangerous, any neglect invited disaster, and the texts that describe these rituals are meticulous, obsessive. They specify every gesture, every word, every ingredient, because the stakes were understood to be absolute. Get it wrong and the world might fail, the crops might die, the rivers might dry up, the cities might empty, the catastrophe might return. This is a worldview we struggle to inhabit from our modern perspective. We are accustomed to thinking of a ritual as symbolic, as metaphorical, as actions that represent meaning rather than create effects. But the Mesopotamian understanding was different. Ritual was technology. It was applied knowledge. It was the method by which human beings interacted with the fundamental forces that governed reality. And just as we obsess over engineering specifications and safety protocols in our own technological systems, they obsessed over ritual correctness, because they believed, based on inherited memory of catastrophe, that getting it wrong had catastrophic consequences, that the world had failed before when these practices were neglected, and that only through continuous perfect observance could failure be prevented. Consider the implications for social structure. In such a worldview, the priesthood is not optional, it is essential infrastructure. The temples are not merely religious institutions, they are the mechanism by which civilization is maintained. The king rules not primarily through military power or administrative skill, though these matter, but through his relationship with the divine, through his ability to perform the sacred kingship rituals correctly, through his role as mediator between heaven and earth. And if catastrophe occurs, if the land fails, if the cities empty, the blame falls on this system, on some failure of ritual, some breach of divine protocol, some error in the maintenance of cosmic order. The catastrophe confirms the importance of these institutions, even as it calls their effectiveness into question. This paradox appears repeatedly in the texts. When disaster strikes, the response is both to acknowledge divine anger and to intensify religious observance, to build more temples, to offer richer sacrifices, to compose new hymns and prayers. The catastrophe is interpreted as evidence that the gods require more attention, not less, that the rituals must be performed with even greater care, that human beings must be even more vigilant in their maintenance of proper relationships with the divine. The texts never suggest that perhaps the rituals are ineffective, that perhaps catastrophe occurs regardless of human action, that perhaps the gods are not actually in control. Such thoughts would undermine the entire social order, would render meaningless the work of generations, would suggest that all the careful record-keeping, all the precise ritual, all the accumulated wisdom was futile, and so the catastrophe is absorbed into the existing framework, is made to confirm rather than challenge the established understanding. The texts describe divine anger, divine judgment, divine testing. They frame catastrophe as meaningful, as purposeful, as part of a larger plan that human beings might not fully understand but that nevertheless makes sense within divine logic. This framing makes catastrophe bearable. It suggests that suffering has meaning, that destruction serves a purpose, that the world that emerges after catastrophe is in some sense better, or at least necessary, even if that necessity is not immediately apparent. The alternative, that catastrophe is random, that it strikes without meaning or purpose, that it simply happens because the universe is capable of producing it, is too disturbing to fully embrace. Yet the texts also contain hints of this darker understanding, moments when the theological framework slips, when the scribes record something that does not fit neatly into the narrative of divine justice. The Ludlul Bel Nemeki, sometimes called the Babylonian Job, describes a righteous man who suffers despite his piety. He has performed all the correct rituals, he has honoured the gods, he has lived according to divine law, and yet he is struck down by disease and misfortune. His friends abandon him, his reputation is destroyed, he becomes a warning to others, and he does not understand why. The text eventually provides a resolution. The god Marduk restores him. His suffering is revealed to have been a test, but the bulk of the text dwells in the uncertainty, in the experience of suffering without explanation, in the terrible possibility that correct action does not guarantee safety, that piety does not prevent catastrophe. This text is subversive even as it attempts to maintain orthodoxy. It acknowledges what everyone knows but rarely speaks aloud, that bad things happen to good people, that the righteous suffer alongside the wicked, that catastrophe does not discriminate based on merit, and while the ending reassures the reader that divine justice will ultimately prevail, the emotional weight of the text rests in the middle sections, in the protagonist's isolation and confusion, in his desperate attempts to understand what he has done wrong, in his gradual realization that perhaps he has done nothing wrong, that perhaps suffering is not always punishment, that perhaps the relationship between human action and divine response is more complex, more opaque than the official theology suggests. These moments of theological doubt are rare in the surviving texts, but they are significant. They reveal the strain of maintaining a coherent worldview in the face of catastrophic experience. The Mesopotamians had inherited a landscape marked by disaster. They lived among ruins. They avoided lands that had failed. They knew that cities could be abandoned, that civilizations could collapse, that the conditions for urban life were not guaranteed, and they had to make sense of this knowledge, had to integrate it into a functional understanding of the world. The theological framework they developed, with its emphasis on divine power and human obligation, on ritual correctness and moral behavior, provided that sense. But it was always under pressure, always threatening to crack when confronted with catastrophe that exceeded the framework's explanatory capacity. The catastrophe we are examining, the one implied in the text through absence and aftermath, may have been one of these moments, an event so large, so inexplicable, that it strained the existing theological understanding past the breaking point. How do you explain a disaster that strikes without warning, that destroys without apparent cause, that leaves the land itself poisoned or dead? You can invoke divine anger, but what transgression warranted such extreme punishment? You can claim it was a test, but what god tests his worshippers by destroying their capacity to worship? You can frame it as cosmic necessity, but what necessity requires the creation of uninhabitable wastelands? These questions have no satisfying answers, and so, perhaps, the scribes chose silence, chose to record the aftermath without attempting to explain the event, chose to preserve the practical knowledge of which lands to avoid without engaging with the theological problem such avoidance raised. This silence is itself a form of record. It tells us that something occurred which exceeded the culture's ability to process it within their existing frameworks, that the event was so anomalous, so outside normal experience, that the usual methods of sense-making failed. We see this pattern in our own time with genuinely unprecedented disasters, events that shatter our assumptions about how the world works. In the immediate aftermath, there is often confusion, competing explanations, attempts to fit the event into familiar categories, and sometimes, eventually, a kind of exhausted acceptance that defies neat explanation, a recognition that some things simply happened, that the why remains unclear, that perhaps clarity is not possible, that we must live with uncertainty and ambiguity. The difference is that we have technologies of memory that the ancient world lacked. We have photographs and video. We have multiple independent accounts. We have scientific instruments that measure and record. We can preserve the event itself in granular detail even when we struggle to explain it. The Mesopotamians had only clay tablets and oral tradition, and clay tablets are expensive. They require skilled labor to produce. They require institutional support to maintain. You cannot record everything. You must choose what to preserve. And in the aftermath of catastrophe, when resources are limited and survival is uncertain, you preserve what has immediate utility, the knowledge of which lands are safe, which water sources are drinkable, which routes avoid the worst damage. The story of how the catastrophe occurred is a luxury, a piece of information that requires stability and surplus to maintain, so the catastrophe fades from the record, not because it was unimportant, but because recording it served no practical purpose. The texts that survived, that were copied and transmitted through generations, were the texts that remained useful. The king lists that established political legitimacy, the legal codes that governed social relations, the religious hymns that maintained divine favour, the administrative documents that tracked economic activity, the geographical surveys that mapped habitable space. These texts occasionally reference catastrophe, but always in passing, always as context rather than content. The catastrophe becomes background, becomes assumption, becomes part of the taken-for-granted reality that does not need explicit explanation, and yet the absence is conspicuous. When we read these texts with attention, when we notice what is not said alongside what is said, the outline of something enormous becomes visible. A disaster so significant that it reorganized the entire geography of settlement, that created permanent zones of avoidance, that altered trade patterns and political structures, that lived in cultural memory for millennia as a warning and a wound. The texts do not tell us what this disaster was, but they tell us that it occurred, that it mattered, that its effects shaped the world that came after in profound and lasting ways. Modern scholarship has attempted to identify specific historical events that might correspond to this textual catastrophe. The hypothesis of a major meteor impact in the 3rd millennium BCE, geological evidence of massive flooding caused by climate shifts, archaeological findings of widespread destruction, layers at multiple sites. Each of these theories has evidence supporting it. Each also has significant problems. The meteor impact theory struggles to explain the geographic distribution of abandoned sites. The flooding hypothesis does not account for the references to heat and fire. The warfare explanation fails to address why some destroyed cities were rebuilt, while others were permanently avoided. No single event fits all the textual and archaeological evidence, which suggests either that our evidence is incomplete, which it certainly is, or that we are looking for the wrong thing, that we are seeking a single catastrophe when the texts may be describing a convergence of disasters, a cascade of failures that compounded each other until the cumulative effect was catastrophic. This model fits the evidence better: a period of environmental stress caused by climate change, drought that strained agricultural systems already weakened by salinization, crop failures that led to political instability and warfare that disrupted trade and destroyed infrastructure, the collapse of trade networks that made recovery more difficult, disease that spread through populations weakened by malnutrition, and possibly, at some point in this cascade, an acute disaster, a flood or fire or impact that dealt a final blow to societies already on the edge of collapse. The texts preserve fragments of this cascade, references to drought, mentions of warfare, descriptions of abandoned cities. But they do not connect these fragments into a single narrative because there was no single narrative. There was only a period of prolonged crisis during which the world fundamentally changed. The concept of cascading failure is familiar to us now. We understand how systems can reach tipping points where small stresses compound into total breakdown. How a drought becomes a famine, becomes a war, becomes a migration, becomes a collapse of trade, becomes the abandonment of cities. How each stage makes the next more likely until recovery becomes impossible, and the only option is systemic reorganization. But the ancient world had no vocabulary for this kind of analysis. They had no systems theory, no models of complexity and emergence. What they had was observation and memory. They could see that the world had changed, that certain places no longer sustained life, that the configuration of cities and trade routes had shifted, and they could pass down warnings about which places to avoid, but they could not explain the mechanism, could not trace the chain of causation from initial stress to final collapse. So the texts describe effects without causes, outcomes without processes. The land is dead, the city is empty, the water is bitter. These are presented as facts of geography, as stable features of the landscape, and perhaps this reflects how catastrophe was actually experienced. Not as a single dramatic event that everyone recognized as transformative, but as a gradual accumulation of problems that only in retrospect could be seen as catastrophic. Each generation made small adaptations, abandoned one field and cultivated another, moved from one neighborhood to a different part of the city, shifted trade from one route to a slightly longer but more reliable alternative. None of these adaptations felt like catastrophe, they felt like normal responses to changing conditions. But over decades, these small shifts accumulated into wholesale transformation, into the abandonment of entire regions, into the creation of permanent dead zones in the landscape. This is the catastrophe that is hardest to record, the one that happens so slowly that no single generation experiences it as disaster. Your grandfather's grandfather worked these fields. Your grandfather worked them with increasing difficulty. Your father could not make them yield enough to feed his family, and you do not work them at all. At what point did catastrophe occur? When the soil first began to degrade, when the yields first started declining, when your father made the decision to seek work elsewhere, when you, never having worked those fields, pass down to your children only the memory that they exist and should be avoided? The event has no clear beginning or end. It is a process, a transformation. And processes are harder to record than events. The texts give us glimpses of this gradual transformation. Administrative records that show decreasing agricultural output over decades, temple archives that note declining offerings, royal inscriptions that mention the establishment of new cities, while older ones quietly disappear from the record. This is the bureaucratic trace of catastrophe, the administrative acknowledgement that the world is changing in ways that require adaptation. But bureaucratic language is not dramatic. It does not announce catastrophe. It notes a resource reallocation. It documents the establishment of new administrative centres. It adjusts tax assessment to reflect changing economic realities. Read individually, these documents seem mundane. But read in sequence, across generations, they reveal the slow collapse of entire regions. And interspersed with these administrative traces are the literary texts, the lamentations, the prayers, the prophecies. These texts have emotional weight that the administrative records lack. They mourn, they plead, they warn, but they also mythologize. They attribute to divine action what the administrative records suggest was environmental and economic process. This is not dishonesty, it is translation. The literary texts are taking the incomprehensible complexity of systemic collapse and rendering it in terms that carry meaning, that provide emotional catharsis, that offer some framework for understanding why the world is failing. The gods are angry, the gods are testing humanity, the gods are punishing transgression. These explanations are not literally true in the sense that supernatural beings are directly causing crop failures, but they are psychologically true. They provide a way to make sense of senseless suffering, to find meaning in the midst of breakdown. Consider the era epic again. The god era, associated with plague and violence, grows restless. He has been inactive too long. He needs to exercise his power, and so he provokes conflict. He disrupts the cosmic order. He causes cities to be destroyed and populations to scatter. On the surface, this is a story about divine caprice, about a god who causes destruction simply because it is his nature. But read more carefully, the text is describing something else. It is describing how violence and disease emerge from periods of stability, how peaceful conditions can breed complacency, how systems that functioned smoothly for generations can suddenly fail when stresses that have been accumulating beneath the surface finally manifest. Error is not an external force descending on an innocent world. Error is the personification of collapse itself, the representation of all the ways that order can break down into chaos. The text describes error's weapon as bringing about destruction that looks like disease, like warfare, like environmental catastrophe. It does not distinguish clearly between these forms of disaster, because in lived experience they blur together. A drought weakens populations. Weakened populations are vulnerable to disease. Disease kills farmers and disrupts agriculture. Agricultural failure leads to conflict over remaining resources. Conflict destroys infrastructure and prevents recovery. These processes feed on each other, amplify each other, and to those experiencing them, it feels like the world itself has turned hostile, like some malevolent force is actively working to destroy everything. Error is the name given to that feeling, the personification of systemic breakdown experienced as hostile intent. And the resolution of the error epic is significant. Error's destruction is not reversed. The cities that were destroyed remain destroyed. The people who died remain dead. What changes is that Error's anger is spent. He withdraws. The The active phase of catastrophe ends, and life continues, but in a diminished world, in a world that has been reorganized around the fact of what was lost. This is not a happy ending, it is an acceptance of reality, an acknowledgement that catastrophe is not something that can be undone, that the world after is not the world before, that recovery is not restoration but adaptation, the creation of new patterns of life around the permanent scars left by disaster. This theme of permanent alteration appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. The world is not static. It changes, and not all changes can be reversed. Some losses are final, some damage is permanent. The great cities of the past, the legendary kings, the golden ages described in the oldest texts, these cannot be recreated. They exist only in memory, only as standards against which the present is measured and found wanting. There is a deep pessimism in this worldview, a sense that history is not progressive but degenerative, that the best days are behind us, that each generation inherits a world slightly more damaged, slightly less abundant than the one their parents knew. This pessimism is rooted in observation, in the visible evidence of past prosperity that could not be maintained, the ruins of cities larger than any current settlements, the canals that no longer carried water, the fields that no longer produced, the texts that described riches and achievements that seemed impossible in the present. All of this suggested that earlier generations had possessed something, some knowledge or divine favour or favourable environmental conditions that had been lost. And the catastrophe, whatever it was understood as the moment or the period when that loss became irreversible, when the trajectory of decline became fixed, when it became clear that the glorious past could not be recovered and that the future would be one of management of scarcity rather than enjoyment of abundance. Yet within this pessimism, there is also resilience. If history is decline, if catastrophe is inevitable, if the world is always threatening to fail, then the appropriate response is not despair but vigilance, not abandonment of effort but intensification of care. The rituals must be performed correctly precisely because the world is fragile. The fields must be managed carefully precisely because they can fail. The knowledge must be preserved precisely because it can be lost. The texts that record catastrophe are not counsel to give up. They are counsel to remember, to maintain awareness that security is not guaranteed, that the conditions for survival must be continuously maintained, that forgetting the lessons of the past invites repetition of past disasters. This is why the texts preserve the memory of abandoned places, even when they do not explain why those places were abandoned. The explanation is less important than the fact. The what matters more than the why. Know that this land failed. Know that this city was emptied. Know that these places exist and should be avoided. This knowledge is practical. It guides settlement patterns. It informs resource allocation. It shapes trade routes and military strategy. And it persists across generations because each generation tests it and finds it valid. Attempts to resettle the abandoned lands fail. The prohibited regions continue to be inhospitable. And so the prohibition is reinforced, the memory is confirmed, and the texts that preserve it are copied and transmitted to the next generation. But memory degrades. Oral traditions shift and change. Even written records can be lost or corrupted. The catastrophe that was vivid to one generation becomes vague to the next, and mythological to the third. The specific details fade, the names of places change, the boundaries of the uninhabitable zones become uncertain, and there is always pressure to reclaim the lost lands. Population growth creates demand for agricultural space. Political ambitions drive expansion. Economic opportunities tempt settlement in marginal areas, and so periodically the prohibitions are tested. New expeditions venture into the abandoned regions, new settlements are attempted, and sometimes these attempts succeed. The land has recovered, time has healed the wounds, the catastrophe was temporary after all, but other times the attempts fail, and the failure reinforces the original prohibition, confirms that whatever happened in that place, its effects persist, that the land truly cannot support human life, and the texts record these failed attempts alongside the original warnings, creating a layered memory where the catastrophe exists in multiple temporal registers, as ancient history, as recent experience, as ongoing condition. The event recedes into the past, but its effects remain present. The catastrophe is both then and now, both memory and current reality. This temporal complexity is part of why the texts are so difficult to interpret. They do not maintain clear chronological distinctions. They blend different time periods. They reference the catastrophe as if it is both distant past and immediate threat. And this blending is not confusion, it is accuracy. Because catastrophe in the ancient world was not a single occurrence, but a recurring possibility. Different disasters at different times in different places, but all following similar patterns, all producing similar aftermath, all requiring similar responses. The texts that survived are the ones that could accommodate this multiplicity. That described catastrophe in ways that remained relevant regardless of which specific disaster the reader had experienced or was threatened by. Consider the flood narratives again from this perspective. There were certainly historical floods in Mesopotamia, devastating floods that destroyed cities and killed thousands. Archaeological evidence confirms multiple major flood events across the region's history, but the flood narrative that became canonical, that was preserved and transmitted, is not tied to any specific historical event. It describes the flood, the archetypal flood, the flood that could happen at any time, and by not specifying which flood. By making it universal and timeless, the narrative maintains relevance. Every generation that experiences flooding can recognize their experience in the text, can find in it guidance and meaning, can connect their immediate suffering to a larger pattern that gives it significance. The same is likely true for the catastrophe we are examining, the environmental collapse, the abandoned cities, the uninhabitable lands. These are described in ways that accommodate multiple historical reference. That can apply to the slow salinization of fields over centuries, to the acute damage from warfare or natural disaster, to the cumulative effects of climate change, to any and all processes that result in the transformation of viable land into wasteland. The texts do not specify because specificity would limit their applicability, would make them historical documents rather than living warnings. And what the culture needed was not history but wisdom, not accounts of what happened, but knowledge of what to avoid. This brings us to the deepest question. What is the purpose of memory when the event itself cannot be recovered? When the catastrophe has been absorbed into landscape and mythology and practical prohibition, but has lost its narrative coherence? When all that remains is the knowledge that something happened, that it was terrible, that its effects persist, but the what and the why and the how have dissolved into silence, the texts suggest an answer. Memory serves not to preserve the past, but to orient the present. Not to explain what happened, but to guide what should be done now. The catastrophe exists in these records not as history, but as permanent context, as the shadow that shapes all decisions about land use and settlement and resource management, as the constant reminder that civilization is conditional, that human presence in any landscape is a negotiation with forces that can withdraw their tolerance at any moment. This is a profoundly different relationship to the past than we typically maintain. We want our history complete. We want comprehensive accounts. We want to understand causation and chronology and consequence. We build archives to preserve everything because we believe that all information has potential value, that we cannot know what future generations will need to know, that erasure is loss and preservation is duty. But the ancient world operated under different constraints. They could not preserve everything. They had to choose, and what they chose to preserve was what served survival, what enabled continuity, what allowed each generation to navigate the world they inherited. The catastrophe was preserved not as a complete story, but as a usable fragment, as a set of warnings embedded in geographical knowledge and religious practice and cultural taboo. And perhaps this fragmentary preservation was not failure but wisdom. Perhaps the catastrophe was not meant to be fully understood. Perhaps complete knowledge of how it occurred would be dangerous, would enable repetition, would invite the very disaster the texts are trying to prevent. The silence around the mechanism of catastrophe might be intentional obscurity, a choice to hide certain knowledge even while preserving awareness that the catastrophe occurred. We see hints of this in the texts that reference forbidden knowledge, that describe gods who possess secrets too dangerous for mortals, that warn against pursuing understanding beyond proper limits. These are not anti-intellectual sentiments. They are expressions of caution about knowledge that could destabilize rather than strengthen social order. If the catastrophe was caused by human action, by some technology or practice that exceeded safe limits, then detailed records of how it was accomplished would be dangerous. They would provide instructions for disaster. Better to preserve only the outcome, only the warning, only the knowledge that certain boundaries exist and must not be crossed. This interpretation explains the pattern we see in the texts: detailed descriptions of aftermath, meticulous preservation of geographical knowledge about which lands are viable, but profound silence about mechanism and cause. The texts are telling us what we need to know. They are withholding what we do not need to know, and the distinction between necessary and unnecessary knowledge is made based on utility for survival. But there is another possibility that we must consider before we close. What if there is no hidden knowledge to preserve? What if the silence exists because the people who experienced the catastrophe did not themselves understand what had occurred? What if they witnessed effects without ever comprehending causes? This is perhaps the most disturbing interpretation, that the catastrophe exceeded the intellectual frameworks available to the witnesses, that it was literally incomprehensible, that they could observe the land dying, the cities emptying, the sky changing, the heat persisting, but could not construct any coherent explanation for what they were seeing, and so they recorded what they could observe: the environmental damage, the social disruption, the geographic transformation, but they could not record an explanation because they had none. This possibility resonates with our own experience of genuinely unprecedented events. The first time a society encounters a new disease, the first time a particular kind of natural disaster strikes, the moment when familiar systems fail in unfamiliar ways. There is a period of incomprehension, of struggling to make sense of observations that do not fit existing categories, of watching effects unfold without understanding what is causing them. And in the ancient world, without scientific method, without instruments to measure invisible forces, without models of how natural systems function, this incomprehension would be total. They would be helpless witnesses to their own destruction, able to observe but not to explain, able to record but not to understand. If this was the case, then the silence in the texts is not strategic. It is not protecting dangerous knowledge. It is acknowledging the limits of knowledge. It is an honest admission that the catastrophe was witnessed but not understood, and the response is to preserve what can be known, the fact that it happened, the geographic extent of its effects, the practical knowledge of which places became uninhabitable, and to embed in cultural practice the understanding that catastrophe is possible, that the world contains forces beyond human comprehension, that safety requires humility before these forces, that the appropriate relationship to the unknown is caution rather than confidence. The texts that survive are the ones that served this purpose, that maintained awareness without requiring comprehension, that functioned as warning without needing to explain. And this is why they are so frustrating to modern readers. We want the explanation they do not provide. We want the complete story. But perhaps the complete story never existed. Perhaps what we have is all that was ever available: a record of aftermath, a map of damage, a set of prohibitions, and the absence of explanation is not gap or loss, but the acknowledgement of a gap that could never be filled. The catastrophe happened, its effects were observed and recorded, and that is all anyone ever knew. This humility before the unknown pervades the later Mesopotamian texts. There is a recognition that human knowledge is limited, that the gods possess understanding that mortals cannot access, that the world operates according to principles that exceed human capacity to fully grasp. This is not primitive ignorance, it is sophisticated awareness of epistemological limits. The scribes who composed these texts were highly educated. They were masters of complex writing systems. They had access to generations of accumulated knowledge. They could perform sophisticated calculations and create detailed records. But they also knew what they did not know. They knew that their explanatory frameworks had boundaries, that some phenomena exceeded those boundaries, that the catastrophe was one of these phenomena, and so they recorded what served their descendants, the knowledge that kept people alive, the warnings that prevented repetition of fatal mistakes, the understanding that the world they inhabited was marked by disaster, and that this marking was permanent, that certain places would never return to habitability, that certain losses were final, that the Golden Age, if it ever existed, was irrecoverable. This is the inheritance they left. Not a complete history, but a functional wisdom. Not an explanation, but a map. Not understanding, but survival. The cities they built rose and fell. The empires they served expanded and collapsed. The gods they worshipped were eventually forgotten. but the abandoned places they marked remained abandoned. The dead lands they avoided remained dead. The prohibitions they established persisted long after the language they spoke became unreadable. The catastrophe outlived every institution that attempted to explain it, outlived every framework that tried to contain it. It persisted as geography, as fact, as the permanent alteration of landscape that no theological or political or social change could reverse. And we, reading their texts thousands of years later, encounter the same silence they encoded. We search for explanations they did not provide. We construct theories they could not have imagined. We apply scientific methods they never possessed. And still, the catastrophe eludes complete understanding. Still, we cannot say with certainty what happened, cannot identify a single event or cause or mechanism that accounts for all the evidence. We are more sophisticated in our ignorance. We can rule out more possibilities. We can narrow the range of plausible explanations, but we cannot fill the silence at the heart of these texts, cannot recover what was never recorded or was recorded and lost or was understood but deliberately obscured. What we have is what they left us, the knowledge that catastrophe occurred, that it was profound enough to reorganize the landscape of settlement across an entire region, that it persisted in cultural memory for millennia as warning and wound, that it shaped how subsequent generations understood their relationship to the land they inhabited and the forces that governed their survival. This is not nothing. This is the transmission of essential wisdom, the preservation of awareness that the conditions for human flourishing are not guaranteed, that the earth can refuse us, that civilizations can fail, that loss can be permanent, and that the appropriate response to this knowledge is not despair but care, not paralysis but mindfulness, not forgetting but remembering. The texts ask us to remember not the event but its possibility, not what happened but that it happened, not the explanation but the outcome. They ask us to carry forward the understanding that we are temporary occupants of a world that does not belong to us, that we exist by permission of forces we do not fully control, that our cities and fields and roads are maintained against constant pressure toward entropy and dissolution. That vigilance is required, that care is not optional, that the boundary between flourishing and catastrophe is thinner than we imagine, that the catastrophe our ancestors experienced, whatever it was, could happen again, in different form perhaps, through different mechanisms, but with similar effects, the transformation of viable land into waste, the emptying of cities, the scattering of populations, the creation of permanent dead zones in the landscape of human possibility. This is the message embedded in the silence. This is what the gaps in the record preserve, not ignorance but wisdom, not confusion but clarity. The catastrophe does not need to be fully understood to serve its function as warning. The absence of explanation does not diminish the value of awareness. What matters is that we know it occurred, that we see evidence of its persistence, that we recognize in the abandoned places and the deadlands the proof that catastrophe is not theoretical, that it is inscribed in the earth itself, that it has happened before and will happen again, and that our task is not to recover what was lost, not to restore what was damaged, but to navigate carefully the world that remains, to honor the prohibitions inherited from ancestors who learned through bitter experience which places are for us and which are not, to maintain the practices that have proven to enable survival, to pass forward to our own descendants not certainty but caution, not mastery but humility, not completion but continuity. The night deepens now, the ancient voices fall quiet, the texts return to silence. What they have told us is not a story with beginning and end, not a narrative that resolves, but a testament to survival, a record of memory choosing what to preserve and what to release, of wisdom knowing that some knowledge serves life and other knowledge does not, of a people who witnessed catastrophe and decided that the lesson mattered more than the details, that the warning justified the burden of memory, that future generations needed to know not what their ancestors understood, but what their ancestors did not understand, that the world contains forces beyond explanation, beyond control, beyond prevention, and that the only response is to walk carefully, to watch for signs, to respect the boundaries, to avoid the places marked by silence, to honor what was lost by not repeating the errors that led to loss, and tonight, As we listen to these ancient silences, as we feel the weight of what was not said alongside what was preserved, we join the long chain of inheritance. We become the next generation, receiving the warning. Learning to recognize the catastrophe not through its causes but through its effects. Not through explanation but through observation. Not through certainty but through careful attention to the places where the earth itself remembers, where the soil refuses, where the ruins stand as eternal testimony, where the wind moves through emptiness that was once home. This is the catastrophe the Sumerians described. Not an event but an aftermath. Not a moment but a permanence. Not a story but a landscape. And the landscape remains, waiting, watching, teaching those who are willing to see that some things, once broken, cannot be mended, only avoided, only remembered, only carried forward as warning into whatever time remains.